Hello everyone, I'm Yasser Saeed and welcome to the class of International Trade Theory, Econ 446. Here today we are going to study the Standard Trade Model. Now in this lecture we are going to study how to measure the values of production and how to measure the value of consumption. Then we are going to study the welfare and terms of trade. Then the effect of these things on the economic growth, and then we will be studying the effect of international transfers of income, and finally we are going to study the effects of imports tariff and exports subsidies in this scenario in the standard trade model. In the previous lecture, we discussed the value of production, how much will be the worth of the total production that we are going to produce. And we found out a point on the ISO value line that was tangent to the production possibility frontier, the point where both these two curves are tangent to each other. We say that at that point we are producing the maximum value. But when we talk about consumption, here the idea changes a bit. Uh, Now, in the absence of international trade, the value of consumption is not required. We actually consume whatever we produce. If we are producing 10 units of clothes and we are producing 15 units of food, then what do we consume? We consume the exact amount that we have produced. But when we are trading, then we have an advantage, and that advantage is that we consume more than we consume a different set than what we have produced. And how much we can consume, that actually depends on the value of our production. So the basic idea is, if we produce a quantity equal to the worth of 100 rupees, then we will be able to consume equal to the worth of 100 rupees. We can buy with those 100 rupees. In order to simply understand it, if we are producing something equal to 120, we sell that in the market for 120, and then we can purchase with those 120 rupees whatever we like. Similarly, if we produce more goods of more worth, let's say of 200, of 300, then we will be able to consume equal to 200 or 300. Now look at this scenario, this equation that we have: PC into DC plus PF into DF equals PC into QC plus PF into QF, and that is the total value. Now the first part, the left hand side of the equation, that is PC into DC plus PF into DF, this is basically the value of consumption. How? PC and PF shows the prices of the two commodities, whereas DC show the demand for cloth and DF show the demand for food. So the total worth of the demand is PC into DC plus PF into DF, and the total worth of whatever we have produced is equal to PC into QC plus PF into QF, and this is equal to the ISO value line that we derived earlier. So the equation basically means we consume equal to the value of our production. Then production choices are determined by the economy, PPF, and the price of output. PC and PF are very much important, because PC and PF determine the slope of the ISO value line, and the slope of the ISO value line determines the point on the production possibility frontier where we produce. But on that same line, on the same ISO value line, we are able to consume as well. What determined the consumption choices? Let us discuss that as well. Consumer preferences and prices determine the consumption choices. Now, we have studied the consumer preferences in microeconomics, and that tells us about the utility curve, the indifference curve. A consumer can choose between two commodities, may choose 15 units of food and 3 units of cloth, or he may choose 13 units of cloth and lesser units of food in that regard, and he can be indifferent between these two. So his choice depends upon the indifference curve and again on the prices of the commodity. Now, each consumer has his or her own preferences. Uh, Two consumers can never be the same. Two consumers in different curves cannot be compared. But we pretend that we can represent the preferences of an average consumer, and we may say that this indifference curve represents the preference of all the consumers at the same time. Now here in this graph you see that we have basically three curves. The red curve represented by this line, the red line, that is the production possibility frontier as we are familiar with. And then we have another familiar line, that is the ISO value line. And again we have a third line or a third curve that we call the indifference curve, but we have multiple indifference curves here. Now, in the last lecture, we talked about the production, how much we should produce, and that is at point Q, where the ISO value line and the production possibility frontier both are tangent to each other. But now we talk about the consumption, how much we should consume. Basically, if there was no trade, then we would be consuming at point Q, because we will be consuming whatever we are producing. But since we can trade with other countries, our consumption must equal to our production. So we can consume anywhere on the ISO value line. Now, the choice that we should make, where we should consume on this ISO value line, depends on the indifference curve. An indifference curve is basically a curve which has multiple choices of consumption. For example, and a consumer has a choice to consume 15 units of food as compared to 5 units of cloth, or he has the choice to consume 10 units of cloth and 8 units of food, and he is indifferent between these two. He consider both the choices equal. So on indifference curve these choices are equal, but on higher indifference curve one prefers the consumption of certain goods to the lowest indifference curve. In this case, if we look at the lowest indifference curve, that is here, uh, we see that it intersects the production possibility frontier. We can produce this much quantity, but we are not going to produce it. Why? Because first, its value is low, and secondly, it does not gives us the maximum utility. Then on the higher indifference curve, again, it doesn't give us that maximum utility. The point D is uh, the point D tells us that this is on the ISO value line, and again along with being on the ISO value line, this is also tangent to the indifference curve. This is where we can get our maximum utility. Now if you look to the other indifference curve, the remaining two indifference curve, they are higher than this indifference curve, and that can give us more utility, but we are unable to consume there. That is beyond our capacity of consumption. So we will consume at point D. Now, when we are consuming at point D, we are not producing that much quantity that is beyond our production capacity. Look at the production possibility frontier and compare these 2 points. Production possibility frontier, we may be able to produce at this point, but D is higher than the point which we could have produced. So if you look at it carefully, point D is greater than our capabilities to produce. We are consuming more than we can produce. So this is the benefit of trade. This is the benefit of international trade. It allows us to consume more worth of goods of more value than we can produce. Actually, we can produce more than we can consume more than what we are able to produce in this type of situations. So again, when we are consuming at point D and we are not producing it, where do we get this excess, or where do we get the shortfall completed from? So look at the difference between the two. When we are producing at point Q, our total quantity for cloth is at QC, you may call it QC dash. So we are producing at this point, but our actual consumption is much lower than that. We are consuming less cloth as compared to what we are able to produce. So what we do with this excess production, we basically export this excess production to other countries. But in order to export, we get our extra cash, and with that cash or foreign reserves, we can import the food. We are not able to produce the food that we are consuming here. We may be consuming, let's say, 1 unit of food, but actually we are producing less than that. So where does this excess food come from? This excess food comes from consumption, from importing. Now this tells us two things. First, in order to consume excess of goods, we need to be able to export. And the second thing is that the amount of import that we can do also depends on the slope of the ISO value line. If ISO value line has a higher slope, then we may be able to import more food for certain amount of clothes. So what do we conclude from this is that the indifference curves are downward sloping to represent the fact that if an average consumer has less clothes, he or she should have more food and still be equally satisfied. And then secondly, the indifference curves farther from the origin represents larger quantities of food and clothes, which should make consumers more satisfied, and more goods are assumed to be more satisfying, or at least more valuable. Then the indifference curves are flatter when moving to the right to represent the fact that as more cloth and less food is consumed, an extra meter square of cloth relative to an extra calorie of food becomes less valuable. Prices also determine the value of consumption, as we have discussed here. When the price of cloth rises relative to the price of food, the economy is better off when it exports clothes, and the ISO value line becomes steeper and a higher indifference curve can be reached. A higher price for cloth exports mean that more food can be imported, and a higher relative price of cloth will also influence the consumption decisions about cloth versus food. A high relative price of cloth makes the consumer willing to buy less clothes and more food. So here finally we can graphically explain the impact of changes in prices. When prices change, our production will move from Q1 to Q2. We will no longer produce at Q1, but we will produce at Q2, and the reason has already been explained for that. The slope of the ISO value line is entirely dependent on the relative prices, but it also changes our consumption behavior. We are now able to consume at a higher indifference curve. So we will not be consuming at D1, but we'll be consuming at DE. So whenever the price of the commodity that we have advantage in increases, this enables us to consume more of other commodities. This will enable, let's say that we had the advantage in production of cloth and the prices of cloth has increased. So the impact will be that we will be able to consume more of food, and why? Because we can purchase more food units with this much amount of cloth. So overall, our demand for food can increase as well. Whenever prices in the market changes, for a consumer, there happens to have two types of effects. One we call the substitution effect, and the other we call income effect. So let us discuss these two effects briefly over here. The change in welfare or the change in income when the price of one good changes relative to the price of another is called income effect. Basically, when prices changes, the purchasing power of the consumer changes, and when purchasing power changes, that is somewhat parallel to the change in income. Then we have another effect that is called the substitution effect. The substitution of one good for another when the price of the good changes relative to another is called substitution effect. And the substitution effect is represented by moving along a given indifference curve. So these two effects can be shown in ways that when we move from one indifference curve to another indifference curve, that is because of the price change, that is called income effect. But when we move on the same indifference curve, we choose a different combination because of the changes in price, that is called substitution effect. And both effects occur simultaneously whenever a price change occurs.